to Theological Table Talk, the podcast that's produced by the Center for Christian Studies. I'm Keith Stanglin, the director of the Center for Christian Studies, and I'm joined as usual by Todd Hall, our associate director. Hey, Todd, how's it going?
Not bad for an old man.
All right. Yes, absolutely. And Todd, as usual, has some interesting background that he's sitting in front of that you folks listening on Spotify and Apple will have to go to YouTube to see. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. We're really happy to be joined today by a couple of very good friends and good guys that are going to talk with us, Steve Clower and Jim Martin. Steve and Jim are both at Harding School of Theology. Steve is a professor of ministry and director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Harding School of Theology in Memphis, and been there for, I should have looked ahead of time. I don't know how many years, Steve. 3, is it? 2 or 3 years?
Yes, I'm finishing my third year.
Okay, finishing third year. And then Jim Martin is vice president at Harding School of Theology and has been there, I want to say, since 2014. Is that right? So
yeah, 10 years. That's right, Keith. 10 years.
Yeah, very good. And we're going to be talking today a little bit just about ministry and leadership in churches. And although I have done ministry for most of my adult life, it's always been adjacent to something else that I've been doing in academia. Jim and Steve are really great conversation partners here because they have been in congregational ministry full time for many years. Their academic work is focused on practical theology and ministry. And so when we at the Center for Christian Studies have the opportunity to do leadership seminars for elders and ministers, or retreats, which we've done a couple of. Steve and Jim are the first two guys I call up to help us with this because of their expertise and just how skilled and gifted they are at this. So I'm glad for that partnership with you two, and I'm glad that y'all joined us to talk about leadership and the challenges of leadership in churches today. So really, my plan here is kind of to sit back and turn it over to Todd, who also has experience as a full-time minister, and probably just let you three do most of the talking here. I'm not going to totally shut up, but I'm going to let Todd ask some questions and let you guys discuss these important issues.
Yeah, I'll lead in and just say thank you guys so much for the work that you've done along with Keith. I just, I think that a lot of times churches don't realize the resources that they have available to them. And you guys are a real blessing to churches. And so we're grateful for that. I'm grateful for that. As somebody in ministry, it's always nice. Jim will tell you, it's always nice to have someone to call and say, I'm thinking about this. I know you've been through this. What should I do with this? So just grateful for you guys and all that you do. And I'm thinking about, ministry in 2024. In some ways, we've got all new things. In some ways, there is nothing new under the sun. And so just thinking out loud here, what do you think are the 2 or 3 most challenging issues facing church leaders today in 2024? And maybe what's different from when, you were ministering earlier in your career, and what sort of challenges do you have now that you don't recognize from back then? Something like that. I'll start with Steve.
Okay. Well, thank you, Todd and Keith, for inviting me and Jim on today. And I appreciate the Center for Christian Studies and what it is doing for churches. And so it's an honor to participate and help with the retreats we've done and also to have this conversation. A couple of thoughts on that. I think one of the challenges, and this is something that's kind of dear to my heart, is that I think a lot of churches struggle to have a sense of mission, and that's a part of my background. And my doctoral work was in how to lead a church to participate in the mission of God. And as I'm just around a lot of churches, that's what I notice, is that many churches don't really have a good sense of how they are participating in God's mission in the neighborhood or the places where they are. They're maybe just trying to take care of one another. They're kind of in a maintenance mode. They're just trying to kind of keep the doors open. And I tell a story in my classes about, I had a student several years ago who he interviewed at a church, and he asked them, what's the dream for this church in the next 5 years? And he's asking this to a group of elders as he's interviewing about thinking about joining the church as the preacher. And the elders respond, they said, well, in 5 years, we're hopeful to have a good, sound worship service. That was kind of their goal, basically just to keep doing what they're doing and remain sound. And he did not take that job when he heard that answer. But I think sometimes churches can intuitively and subconsciously, that is their vision, just to do Sunday morning again. We did it this week. Let's do it again. And let's try to do it a little bit better next time. And getting a bigger picture of how God has a mission for this world, has purpose for this world, and how does our church fit into that at this time and in this place? I think that is a challenge that a lot of leaders struggle to know how to answer. So that would be one. I think a second, and this would be a challenge that I think is greater now than like when I first started in ministry, and that would be just the divisiveness in our culture, and that there's just a lot of polarization in our culture. A lot of that stems from partisan politics, but in other ways too. I think the postmodern influence around us affects this. The globalization of our world pulls us kind of in many different directions. And so elders and ministers find themselves ministering to a church that often can be pretty divided and is hearing and being influenced by many different voices that are pulling them many different directions. And so how do I bring this church together around the gospel? I think that is a huge challenge. And it seems to me over the past 5 years, that's just really grown and developed. Where churches are really having to grapple with, how do we manage the polarities within our congregation, because they are very polarized. And then I'll just say a third one real quickly, and then Jim can answer. I think another challenge is that I think church leaders can struggle with role ambiguity. I think elders can struggle with just knowing what they're supposed to be doing. Like, what does it mean to be an elder? I had a couple of years ago, I had a phone call, and I wrote about this in my article in the Journal of Christian Studies. I got a phone call from an elder here in Memphis who had just been appointed as an elder, and he called me not because he knew me, he just knew I was the new professor of ministry at Harding School of Theology, and he just assumed that I must know the answer to questions because of that. But he calls me and just says, I just was appointed a new elder. What am I supposed to be doing? It was just an honest, vulnerable question.
That's
And
beautiful.
I think elders can struggle with it. I think ministers can struggle with that of, is my role to be more pastoral, or is my role to be more of an evangelist? I think ministers cannot have clear expectations on that, and the congregation can have a mixed bag of expectations for their ministers, and that can just be very stressful. Like, what am I here to do? What am I called here to do? What has God called me here to do? And so I think that's a challenge to navigate.
Excellent. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
we want to comment or ask questions about these before we move on? What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I was, if I can just comment along those
Yeah.
lines, I I I wonder, Steve, if there's interconnection between this sort of lack of purpose and the divisiveness. Because it seems if you can get people rallied around a particular purpose, but somewhere along the way, it seems like leaders have kind of lost a sense of purpose. And so I'm just wondering, it's interesting. There may be not really a question, just more of a comment, kind of something to think about.
I think that is a good comment, and I think that is a pathway forward is in a divisive culture is to galvanize people around the mission of God and
Mm,
say instead of focus, churches um, can be can have attention deficit disorder. They can be drawn to many different things very quickly. And so if you can pull a church together to say, here's what we need to be focused on. Here's our calling, here's our purpose, here's our mission. Let's stay focused on it. I think that does help with the divisiveness that can creep in to our
mm,
congregation.
good. Yeah. I also note just with the divisiveness, it's just interesting. Y'all were in ministry long before I was. I really started full time again in 2018. So, coming out of the academy into the church and was a big step. But one of the things that I note really during COVID and with all of the wars really over masking and, all that different kind of stuff, I saw among some of my minister friends just real loneliness. The divisiveness left them really isolated because they're trying to sort of maintain a presence of peace and, but at those times it was just practically impossible
Mhm.
um, to to walk without everybody being mad at you, And so I just wonder, has it always been a lonely job? Did it get lonelier during COVID? Do you think, those kind of things?
That's a good question. I think my opinion is that I think leadership in the church is always going to have an element of loneliness, um, because when you're a leader, you're just assuming a role, and it's just a different. You're at a different place, a different situation than where you were before, and as a minister and as I train ministers, I encourage them to develop friendships with ministers from other congregations. They will be of help to you during those times. I think that's good for elders as well. Um, I mentioned before we got on that we were in Texas this past weekend, and me and my wife were I was leading an elders retreat. It was actually for future elders. They were getting ready to be appointed elders and their wives. And so we did a session where I talked with the elders and my wife talked with the elders' wives. And that was one thing that my wife, Lindsay, told the future elders' wives is you might feel some loneliness in
Mm,
this. And they were a little bit surprised by that. But I think it was a reminder for them. And I think you're right that during a divisive period like we've experienced in COVID, it just felt even more lonely. And I think in COVID, a lot of ministers struggle with role ambiguity. What am I supposed to be doing? Um, I heard that from different ministers. I don't really know. I've lost a sense of my calling and what I've been doing on a regular basis that I felt like was making a difference in people's lives. I'm unable to do those things right now. So, like, what am I really supposed to be doing? So, I think that role ambiguity adds into the discouragement and the loneliness that sometimes we can feel as leaders.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, those are great points. And we'll have to do another podcast addressing these great concerns because we could be here all day. But I'd love to just briefly, one quick question on mission and mission for the church. So I'm assuming that you do workshops or at least try to help various churches sort of think through what their mission is. Do you envision sort of each congregation having something like a particular mission that suits them, and they kind of have to figure out what that particular mission is, or, is it more broad than that, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and sometimes those words, mission, vision, can be used interchangeably and with different definitions. But the way I like to think about it is every congregation has a calling or missional vocation, is another way of putting it, missional vocation, where they're seeking to embody the gospel at this time and in this place. And that's going to look a little bit different. Depending on the congregation and the place that it's in and at the time that it's in. So it's going to look a little bit different in its history as well. And so to kind of arrive at that missional vocation, I mean, there's not like a step by step, formula, but the way that I approach it is vision, vocation, it's developed through listening. So we need to listen. And there's three areas that we need to listen in. Number one, we need to listen to God first and foremost, and his word. What does his word tell us? In particular, like, what are the scriptures that really matter to us? What are the scriptures that really resonate with us as a church? What are the scriptures that kind of really shape our understanding of discipleship and our understanding of living out the Christian life? Because those scriptures are going to kind of shape our vocation as well. So listening to God. Then number two, listening to the church. So who are we? What are we gifted at? What do we feel a sense of calling towards? A lot of times the answers to those questions can be found in our history. So what is the story of our church? What have been the significant moments in our church where God has worked in us in a powerful way? What have been kind of critical moments where we've taken risks as a church and God has blessed us, just kind of retracing our narrative and what has been significant for us as a church. So that'd be number two, listening to that. And then number three, listening to the community or to the neighborhood, to the city, which I find that a lot of churches rarely do. They have a lot of untested assumptions about the neighborhood that they reside in or the city that they reside in. And so finding a way to listen to people of our city or neighborhood, listen to the civic leaders, listen to the hospital chaplains, listen to the public school teachers and administrators, listen to the business people, try to find a way to listen. What are the losses and longings that people in our neighborhood share? What are the burdens that we feel as we hear people in our neighborhood share? Where do we notice that our city hurts? Like, what are the hurts of our city? Where does our city agonize over the brokenness of sin? So as we're listening to those three areas, over time, there's going to be some intersection points. And I think at those intersection points is where we find our missional vocation as a church.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Very good. Jim, top two or three challenges?
Like Steve, I'm glad to be here and appreciate so much the work of the center, and particularly you, Keith, and Todd. One I would mention, I think this is a real challenge today, and particularly in the U.S., and that is, what does it mean to be a Christian? Or what does it mean to be a disciple? We Christians can get pretty defensive, but the truth is, the world has been pretty disappointed by the behavior of so many of us. And uh, there's a real challenge, but it's an opportunity to follow Jesus afresh and to ask, what does it mean if I take him seriously, if I follow him? What does a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? What does an ordinary day look like if I take Jesus seriously? I think that's a real challenge, but it's a real opportunity. Second one is that I'd mention is, and it relates to one of the ones Steve mentioned, is we're just dealing with a number of people who no longer want to be identified in any way as a Christian or as a part of a church due to the politics and culture wars. It is March 19th. This morning, Fresh Air, an NPR podcast program, released a discussion pertaining to a book in which evangelicals have walked away. Okay, and the podcast, what I heard of it was the discussion about that. At the same time, there are a lot of ministers right now who are pretty nervous about this upcoming election. Will this be like the last one in our churches? Will there be people for one side and people for the other side? And with me as a minister somehow trying to navigate this, and to use your word a while ago, feeling very isolated and lonely in the middle of it. I think that's a huge challenge. What do we do when in the middle of a climate that is polarized and not just polarized in general, but there are dates on the calendar that contribute to this, like this upcoming national American election. I just think those are two of the big challenges. One, and then if I'd mention a final one, and that's as churches, as we try to figure out what is it like to be a church and to be a Christian in a culture where I feel like I'm in the minority. And granted, that may depend upon where you live, your location. There are places in the States where you'll still find lots and lots of Christian trappings, but there are many places where those have all gone away. So those are just three I would mention.
Yeah, those are important too. Thank you so much for that. Regarding the first one, just what does it mean to be a Christian? And we Christians have not behaved so well. I can't remember who it was, but there's an evangelist who had a great quote that said the single greatest cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their mouth and step out and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And I think that sums it up really well. We have not done a great job, and that connects, I think, with the third one. What does it look like to live as the church in which, Christians in general are moving towards becoming the minority? What do you think? I think that's kind of always been the case, even though we've had the trappings of Christianity, we've been a Christian culture, all those kinds of things. I think in some ways that made it more difficult to be a real disciple because you weren't challenged on what you thought and how you were behaving and those kinds of things. And so maybe that's one of the biggest frustrations ministers experience. Ministers tend to be really excited, really trying to be disciples, really trying to make disciples. And it's always difficult because it seems like there are a lot of people who are not really interested in being disciples. So that's one of those challenges that I think we all face. And I don't blame people. Life is busy and hard, and there's a lot of stuff to do, and it makes being a disciple difficult. But yeah, I think those two to me link together really, really well. And I think one of the things that we've maybe in our fellowship have shied away from that's now becoming popular, which is good, is the whole idea of spiritual formation as discipleship, that sort of thing. Are you guys seeing sort of an increase in interest in that in various churches and people looking for help with that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I see a lot more interest around spiritual formation, spiritual disciplines. I'm just using that language a lot more.
Yeah.
We're spending a lot more time here HST talking about it than when I was a student here, for example.
Hmm.
And with the growth of spiritual direction, which is kind of a fancy way of just describing about going with one-on-one, walking with someone, listening to them, helping them in their walk with the Lord. But we're seeing people being trained in that and helping be good listeners, helping people with formation. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot more of that, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, very healthy.
Todd, I think there's an awareness on several fronts regarding this. As what Steve just said, I think more preachers are thinking about preaching as a part of spiritual formation, that I'm not just imparting information, but my preaching helps to shape a church. I think a lot of, well, no, I don't know about a lot of churches. Some churches are asking in moments of serious reflection, what are we forming and shaping as a as a congregation, and what practices are we engaged in that help form and shape these people, and what are we doing that may be forming and shaping people in ways that we need to make some adjustments.
Mm,
So I see more reflection regarding that as well.
yeah, that's good. Yeah, and I'm also interested, since you're both uh, ministers also in the academy. So my work and my dissertation was on spiritual formation, the pedagogy of spiritual formation in seminaries, or lack thereof, really. But you are seeing, at least there at Harding and elsewhere, maybe sort of an increase in interest in imparting that to, but part of it is the academy just took for granted that students would have been discipled when they came to seminary, and rightly so, because discipleship was the job of their churches. And so, the early seminaries weren't concerned about that. It wasn't their job. But more and more, it seems like that is the job of a seminary as well, is to show theology itself as a spiritual discipline, and the
Mhm.
way that forms and shapes and that kind of thing. So you're seeing a growth of interest in that in the academy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just even in the courses that I teach, we spend more time just reflecting on scripture in a more kind of devotional sort of way. I teach a course in our master's program called Theological Foundations for Ministry. It's a 3-hour course, but we split it out over the whole year, fall, spring, and summer. So you take 1 hour each semester. And as a part of that course, you are a part of a discipleship cohort that meets every 2 weeks. You also practice kind of personal spiritual practices. You journal. You take a personal retreat day. I mean, you just do various things throughout the whole year to cultivate those formational habits in your life that you can then hopefully continue and then share with others. And I think that's been good. I don't know, Todd, if it's a shift in kind of the trends in theological education, or if it's a response or reaction to kind of the current situation in our churches and in our culture. But I definitely think there is a turn towards formation right now in theological education. Again, it could be because we're seeing that as young people come to seminary, that the need, used to the need was we need to deconstruct your faith and reconstruct it in a more healthier way. But I think now we're seeing that that's not really the need. The need is more, we want to help form your faith to a more developed and mature perspective that can then help guide and lead congregations. And I'm seeing that shift right now.
Right.
Todd, you mentioned, or maybe it was Keith in the introductions, that Steve directs the Doctor of Ministry program here at Harding School of Theology. So occasionally I've had the opportunity to be around some of his students. I have never heard Steve teach a D-Min class, I don't think, but I've been around his students. They talk about formation. I'm talking about just standing in the hall or on the phone to me. They talk about their own formation. They talk about their own spirituality. They talk about their own need for growth and maturity. Um,
Mm.
I, I just find all of that so refreshing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that sort of actually works as a good slide into the next question that I was thinking through. And so a lot of times in our churches, the way in our fellowship, the way it works is somebody says, you ought to be an elder. Um, and, the process of that is basically sort of, depending on the congregation, it's very different, but, reflecting on the background of this person and, are they a Christian and, do they have faithful children and, all the different kind of stuff that we go through. And then when you're done with that, it's okay. Now you're an elder. We may have an ordination ceremony or something like that, or not. But
No one objected.
right,
That's yeah.
that's that's sort of the central thing.
Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. But so I wanted to just say, you know, it's your dream world now, and every church comes to you as they're going through the elder formation or decision process. They've got a new group of elders, and uh, you have been tasked with training them. In a dream world, what would you find to be like essential for church leaders to be equipped in as they get started?
Okay, that's a good question. I'll take a stab and then Jim can clean up my mistakes. Well, I think that in churches of Christ, we need more opportunities for training for elders, and then also connected with that, experiences for elders and ministers together. You know, we have a we have preacher schools, to use that term. We have seminaries where you can get formal degrees. But what do elders do, and where do elders go? I think there's a gap there. And I think most people are recognizing that. I hear that from elders and from other leaders, like, where do we go to get some training? So I think that is a gap. I think that's something that um, needs to be filled and maybe hopefully can be filled. But in terms of just actual like curriculum or just kind of what kind of training, I think, first of all, spirituality is going to be very important. In my experience, elders often have a somewhat pretty good spirituality because they've developed good character over the years. Hopefully, spirituality is connected with that, but definitely that's important. Um, the number one thing that an elder does is he prays. I mean, that's the number one thing. In fact, the one specific practice that we have in the New Testament that elders are supposed to do is found in James chapter 5, that when you're sick, you are to call the elders for them to pray over you. So number one thing elders can do is pray. So spirituality, I think, is very important. I think understanding your role is important as well. And like I mentioned, elders can struggle with role ambiguity. And so just spending some time to go back through the Old and New Testaments, because the role of elder is not just a New Testament idea, to go back through those passages and just um, reclaim, what does it mean to be an elder? What's the vision around this role? And let's think through that collectively. I think that's important. One practice I like to do with new elders is to invite them to just write down what are the top three things that an elder is supposed to do, and they write it down, and then let's put all these together. Where are we aligned and where are we not aligned? Because we have a lot of different perspectives on what an elder is supposed to do. But I think coming to an understanding of what our role is as an elder, I think a third area would be team. How do we develop a good team? Elders and the ministers need to work together as a team. You can't lead the church by yourself. You need a group to do this. And so what does that look like? Navigating anxiety and conflict is another issue that I think is important because of the anxiousness in our culture right now. And as a leader, you're going to be faced with that. And a lot of times new elders and their spouses are surprised by how much anxiety is brought to them, and they're not really sure how to handle that. I referencing that time this past weekend in Texas where I led this retreat for these new elders, and I talked about anxiety with them and talked about how you can triangulate and be sucked into an anxious situation. And I had a elder's wife who came up to me after and said, I have struggled with this so many times. I get pulled into so many situations because of people's anxiety, and they're wanting, to pull me into this. So I think that's an area. Shepherding, just the practice of walking with people in the valleys of life and how to do that in a healthy manner. I think elders are going to need to know how to do that and need guidance on that. Then the last one I'll say is um, discernment, decision making. How do we make decisions? Because elders are going to make decisions. We hope that that's not all they do, but they are going to do that. And so, how do we do this to where we are guided by a spiritual vision, and that we're making these decisions as a way of pursuing the will of God and not simply what's expedient? We're not just doing what the majority wants, but we're really pursuing the will of God as we make this decision. So those would be at least a first pass at things I would want to help elders with.
Yeah, that's excellent. And it's also really good to hear this, because, I'm just thinking about our polity. There's not always a great relationship between the minister and the elders, as you might imagine. But it's helpful to go through this and think about, what it would be like to be a man who has been a faithful Christian for a long time, but whose primary training is in business or something else, and now is shoved into the eldership. And like you said, I was thinking especially about navigating anxiety and conflict. If they're used to sort of a white collar workplace, their navigating anxiety and conflict is quite different than the pastoral approach that they're going to need in a church. And I don't know, just listening to you, I thought, yeah, churches and ministry staff especially need to find a way to develop more compassion for elders,
Mm.
as they carry some burdens that they're really not equipped to carry. So that's helpful. Really, really good. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, that, as you mentioned in the decision-making area, what I find is a lot of elders in other areas of their life, the way they've made decisions has often been influenced by kind of a majority rules, Robert's Rule of Order kind of way of managing a meeting and agenda and making decisions. And I always like to bring that up to elders and say, where did that come from? And I brought that up this past weekend, and one elder said, well, did it come from Robert? Robert Rules. And my point is, it didn't come from Scripture. And so maybe there are other ways by which we can make decisions that might be a little bit more faithful to what we find in Scripture. And so just getting leaders to think about that from a spiritual theological vision, because we're trying to pursue the will of God. We're not just trying to make decisions quickly and expediently.
Yeah. Jim, you've got your dream job here. You can equip the elders right at the very beginning. What do you want them to know? What skills, that sort of thing?
And I've had these conversations. Uh, you know, being an elder, much like being a minister, is basically relational. I mean, if you serve as an elder, get ready for a ministry that is very relational. Um, in Churches of Christ, Lynn Anderson's book, and it was written in the 90s, but They Smell Like Sheep, for a new elder, is still Shepherding 101. It is still very, very good. Because what happens sometimes is a person becomes an elder and they know some people in the congregation, but they're about to see a different side of people. And, as one elder said, I never dreamed our people had so many problems. And it can be just absolutely overwhelming. And just to try to understand, how does a shepherd function? Now, granted, serving as an elder involves more than shepherding. There is a leading aspect, but I just want to stay with the shepherding part right now. I'm going to give you, here's one little exercise, for instance. This is a shepherding exercise, and this is something I learned a long time ago. So you're in your congregation and you notice that there is a man that looks different. He just looks very sad. He's with his family, but there's something distant about the way he looks. And you've noticed this in the last 4 or 5 weeks. And something tells you that something's wrong. But here you are, an elder, and you don't know what to say. One of the things I've done, and I've encouraged elders to do this, and by the way, I'm now in reference to this man, I'm not talking about a total stranger. I'm talking about somebody in your congregation that at least you're an acquaintance with. To be able to approach that person, not in front of everybody, but maybe off to the side, and just to say something like this: I've noticed over the last month, you seem sad. And I've wondered to myself, should I say something? And then I thought, I wonder what's wrong. I have this sense that something's not okay. And then to look at him in the eye and just say, am I even in the ballpark? And say nothing more. And what I've found often happen is that person will say, I just found out I had cancer, or my wife is leaving me, or our son-in-law left our daughter. And all that is, it's one tool, but it could be a very valuable tool for a new shepherd. And then we can talk. I could talk more about following up and that kind of thing, but that's just an example of good shepherding. So maybe just beginning with a book like They Smell Like Sheep. And again, it's dated and the context is different, but at least it puts your toe in the water and lets you kind of look around. And Steve mentioned this whole business of triangling and the emotions. Serving as a shepherd, this is an emotional thing. And the same is true, by the way, for ministers. Peter Scazzero, Scazzero, Peter Scazzero, preached in New York City for years. The emotionally healthy leader. The emotionally healthy leader. One thing that is true of every elder, when you become an elder, you have a history of how you've dealt with conflict. There's some kind of history there. Maybe your history is you've dealt with it very well and kind of upfront. Maybe your history is you said something like, "Oh, it's all good," and you kind of went on. Or maybe your history is that you acknowledge it, but you minimize it. But you've got a history. And dealing with a book like Scazzero, reflecting on how you deal with conflict, because what you don't want to do is to bring in that baggage into the way you deal with conflict in a congregation or the way you deal with ministers. You may have come from a home, for instance, where your daddy yelled and screamed when there was conflict. I've seen church leaders move in that direction at times when they got angry. This is an emotional ministry, and I need to reflect on how I deal with conflict, how I deal with my anger and frustration at times. I also need to learn how to recharge myself, and a book like Scazzero can help you do that. I want to mention one final resource. Um, I talked to Steve earlier in the day. I wasn't sure if about I looked up this resource again, and I want to mention it now because it's easier to get to than I thought. HopeNetworkMinistries.org. HopeNetworkMinistries.org. That's just one long word, HopeNetworkMinistries.org. When you get to the site, look up resources. Under resources, it has a section for elders and shepherds. It just says elders/shepherds. There is a book there entitled Navigating the Storm. You can actually purchase chapters for $1.99 each if you just want to look at what some people have written about serving as an elder or just serving as a church leader. There's some excellent chapters in there, or you can buy the whole thing. But these are just kind of starting points that might be helpful.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, that's wonderful resources, and I know that our listeners will make use of those. Would be great. I think all that would also be great for ministers. You know, a lot of us, whatever training we've gotten, we've always need more, and it's always good. I would say, just to add to Jim's resources, if you're young in ministry or you're young in shepherding, find someone old in ministry and old in shepherding and learn from them. Really yoke yourself to them. I think that is really, really good advice. It's been helpful for me. I think that we've kept you guys a while now, but I just wanted to real quick. One of the things that y'all have done, and we did an e-blast on this a week or two ago, was the retreats with CCS for congregations. I have not been blessed to be able to be at one of those yet. Sunday comes every week. Did you know that? This is crazy. But anyway, I think there's something about retreats, and I wanted to just kind of get your take on, should churches really take more seriously time away for their leadership, for elders and ministers together, that kind of thing. And what are the benefits maybe that you think of getting out, being off somewhere and going through something like that?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. I definitely think that a yearly rhythm, a healthy yearly rhythm for elders and ministers is to get together and have a retreat. I think that's healthy for several reasons. Number one, if you want to build a team, which needs to happen if the church is going to be unified and if there's going to be kind of a consistency moving forward, then you need time together. You need informal time together. And if all the time that we have being together is in a meeting, in a conference room, you're not going to be a team. And you can just look at other teams in our society and, okay, how is a basketball team developed? How's a football team? They're going to have they're going to practice together and have some team meetings, but they're also going to do some fun together. They're going to have some significant time together. So informal interaction is very important. I think it's also important to include spouses in that from time to time, because if you're going to have a team, the spouses are a part of that. If two spouses do not feel connected to each other, that affects the team. It really does. And how elders and ministers and their spouses interrelate in many ways is going to set the tone for the rest of the congregation. So a retreat just builds that and develops that. I think a second part of this is that it allows the elders and ministers to think big picture. A lot of times in our meetings, we're just thinking about the next week, or we're thinking about the next month, or we're thinking maybe about the next quarter, and we're just kind of plodding along. But when you have a retreat, you can really take a step back, and the way I like to put it, get up on the balcony and just look big picture, think big picture about where we're going as a church, where we're going as leaders. I never encourage elders or ministers that when you go on a retreat together to just have one big long agenda and, hey, we're going to, instead of having a 1 hour and a half meeting, now we can have a 6 hour meeting and we can really cover all these things. No, that would be terrible. Use that time to get above the fray and to think big picture, to think about larger themes, larger ideas that can significantly shape our church, maybe for the next year, for the next 2 or 3 years. This can also be a time of just personal growth and development, which is the best thing that we bring to our leadership. So for those reasons, I highly recommend that rhythm for leaders, breaking away for 24 hours or whatever, to be together.
Right. I think probably getting ready to wrap it up, Keith, gets close to an hour now.
Yeah, I've been really good about being quiet, like I tried to be. But just listening to this, a couple of things came to mind. One is just when I was listening to Steve and Jim, I was thinking, uh, you're getting a nice little slice of the kind of content that you would get in one of these retreats. Because I've heard them in those settings. Todd, you haven't, as you said, but all our listeners, I think, hopefully are encouraged by and even just sort of inspired by some of these ideas that we've heard from Steve and Jim, and just the wisdom that you two have to share with us. If you were encouraged by that, or you thought that's a really good point, then you're getting, like I say, a very small slice of what these retreats are like. So certainly Center for Christian Studies is one of these resources. I think that's good for elders, in even just like a podcast like this, or the retreats, or the other resources we provide for even theological training in an informal sort of way. I wanted to ask too, put you on the spot just a little bit, Steve, and just a minute, if you could briefly just tell us a little bit about the new center that is going to be starting up in Memphis, and just give a little plug for that. I know it's very early in the planning stages, but what is that?
Sure. So starting in the fall, starting August 1st, there will be a new Harding University Center for Church and City Engagement that will be located in Memphis, Tennessee. It'll be housed, or the offices will be in the Holmes Road Church of Christ building, which is located in Whitehaven, which is a neighborhood just south of downtown Memphis. This center, the mission statement of it is that it exists to provide resources, training, and experiences for both students and church leaders to engage the city for the mission of God. And so there's kind of two angles of this center that really parallels a little bit of my own journey. And I'll just say this real quickly. So I grew up in Searcy, Arkansas, went to Harding Academy in Searcy, went to Harding University, and had great experiences, and faith was nurtured there. But then after I graduated from Harding University, I moved to Memphis me and my wife, Lindsay, and we were here for 3 years while I was going to school at HST. And there was something about being in Memphis for those 3 years that really shaped me and changed me. Part of it certainly was the theological education I was receiving, but also part of it was just being in an urban context for the very first time and seeing racial tension and seeing poverty and just walking on a secular campus at the University of Memphis and just various things like that. Well, when I graduated with my MDiv, I moved to Fort Worth, Texas, and I feel very strongly that my ministry in Fort Worth would have been much different if I had moved straight from Searcy to Fort Worth. But the fact that I detoured in Memphis really impacted kind of the vision that I had coming to Fort Worth. Then the second part is that while I was in Fort Worth, I was minister at Southside Church of Christ for 15 years, which is 2 miles south of downtown Fort Worth in the heart of the city. And so within 3 miles of our building, there was over 100,000 people. That was a very diverse set of people, from very wealthy to people living on the streets, different ethnicities. And our church was trying to reach out to them. And one of the struggles that I noticed during that time is where are the resources? Where are the other churches in our fellowship that I can connect with, that we can work together and share together? I kind of struggled to find that. So I'm hopeful the center will basically do both of those things that I described. Number one, help Harding and HST students have urban experiences that will prepare them and equip them for ministry in the city. And then number two, I hope the center will provide resources and training and experiences for church leaders currently who are working with churches that are in metropolitan areas and are really trying to engage their neighborhoods and are noticing the complexity of that and are wanting to view their city through a missiological lens. And I'm hopeful the center can help church leaders do that. So that's the goal, that's the dream, and that'll be launching this fall.
Well, that sounds wonderful, Steve. So just so everybody is aware, the sort of part of the context here, that Harding School of Theology will be moving from Memphis, where it's been for 66 years, to Searcy. But Steve will be staying in Memphis, still as a ministry professor for HST, but also to direct this new center for Harding in Memphis. And I can't think of a better person to be directing that. So we look forward to all the things that God's going to do through you and that in the center there, and partnerships that we will continue with you with the Center for Christian Studies as well. Well, it is time to wrap it up. And like I said, we could keep talking about these issues for a long time, but this conversation's been really helpful. So Steve, Jim, thank you so much for your time with us at this hour and for the wisdom that you've shared with us and with the audience. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We enjoy being here.
Yeah,
right.
thank you. And thank you all for listening to Theological Table Talk. I want to invite listeners, if you haven't already, to follow or subscribe to Theological Table Talk on Spotify or Apple. And as I said earlier, these episodes are also available on our YouTube channel. So give the podcast a like and a 5-star review if you like it. Share a comment or a question with us that you'd like to discuss, or if you have suggested topics or guests that you'd like to see here, contact us. Email us at info@christian-studies.org. And while you're there, check out the Center for Christian Studies at christian-studies.org. And if you like what you see on the website, and you like what you've heard here today, hit that give button and help support what we're doing. So thank you for joining us at the table today for Theological Table Talk. Until next time.